The gospel can be found in your pew Bibles on page 842, Luke chapter 9, 28 through 36. Now about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly, they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now, Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. And while he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silent, and in those days told no one any of the things they had seen. This is the gospel of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Please be seated. The year was 1995. The place was post-apartheid South Africa. The president, newly elected Nelson Mandela. It was a time in South African history that was fraught with tension, but it was also a time of change and potential for new possibilities. After 27 years in prison, Nelson Mandela had just been elected president in the country's very first democratic election. And he was elected by a massive majority. And although apartheid was gone, the racial disconnect between the black majority of the population and their former Afrikaner oppressors remained as entrenched as ever. Mandela knew that in order to work towards peace and reconciliation, he must have the trust of all the people. Now, he knew he had the support of the South African black majority, but he needed the trust of the Afrikaners. So in order to begin rebuilding peace, he initiated a unique venture. He set out to unite the apartheid-torn country by enlisting the national rugby team on a mission to win the 1995 Rugby World Cup. Well, why rugby? Well, you see, the South African rugby team, known as the Springboks, were the darlings of the formerly ruling Afrikaners. But for most non-white South Africans, they were the symbol of brutal and humiliating repression. With the post-apartheid changes, Mandela knew that Afrikaners had a fear of losing their identity. So rather than dismantling the rugby team, Mandela rallied the entire country behind a symbol of the Afrikaner identity, the Springboks. Well, the Springboks went on to win the 1995 Rugby World Cup. They won no less in their home country and against their biggest rivals. This win became one of the most memorable upsets in sporting history. Clint Eastwood would go on to make a movie about it, starring Matt Damon and Morgan Freeman, called Invictus. But this rugby win was more than just a moment in sports history. It became a moment when South African blacks and whites were cheering and chanting together as one. It was a moment where together they could embrace the possibility of a new way of being people together. A South African pastor said, when the final whistle blew, we were all brothers and sisters, and we were all filled with a euphoria born of hope and seemingly limitless possibilities. This rugby win was a mountaintop experience for South Africa. It was a moment that shined with glory. It was inspiring, exhilarating, and life-changing to all who witnessed it. There was a moment when everyone was cheering together. But like all moments, it had an end, and when it was over, people had to return to their daily life. Was full peace and reconciliation established in this moment? Did everyone agree to get along because of this moment? No. This experience was not a quick fix to the struggles within South Africa. It did not immediately change the fact that people were struggling and continue to struggle in the valleys of South African life. Crime rates still remained high. Racism continues to raise its head, and poverty, unemployment, and AIDS still remain huge challenges. Yet South Africans keep going back to 1995, to the glory and hope of that memory, and to continue to work for the possibilities that were imagined. The same pattern can be found in almost every individual's life. We have moments, mountaintop experiences that live forever in our hearts, and they are surrounded by a glow of hope and possibility. We remember our achievements, our loves, our happiest or most powerful life experiences, and we return to them often to draw strength, inspiration, and confidence for challenges ahead. Well, I wonder if it was any different for Jesus. In our gospel story today, we hear Luke tell of a mountaintop experience. While actually taking place on a mountain, it was certainly more than your ordinary hiking expedition. Jesus takes his 3 closest disciples to the top of this mountain, and something happens. Jesus is changed. His disciples are changed. We call this moment the Transfiguration. Jesus glows white and shines like the sun, and he's joined with Elijah and Moses, and from the heavens, God's voice repeats what is said to Jesus at his baptism. "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." The disciples are filled with many emotions. They're terrified. But then at one point, Peter is so taken by the experience, he doesn't want to leave, asking to build tents to stay. Well, why this mountaintop experience? Maybe it helps if we set this event into the context of Jesus' life. Jesus had just gotten through telling his disciples that he is going to suffer and die and be raised again. Jesus has begun to set his sights on Jerusalem. He's preparing to face suffering and abuse, and maybe in this glowing moment, surrounded by Moses and Elijah and embraced in the light of God, he experiences such glory and affirmation that it sustains him through all that lies ahead. And more than this, it confirms for him his belief in the resurrection which is to come. And for his disciples who witness this, it is an experience that assures them of God's presence in Jesus. It affirms for them who Jesus is. Jesus is the Son of God. He stands next to Moses and Elijah, which is affirmation that Jesus has come to fulfill the law and the prophets. He has come to bring the promise of God's forgiveness and mercy and peace for all the world. Maybe this experience gives them confidence to trust and to continue to follow Jesus, even if it means following Jesus to the cross. So I think that most of us, if not all of us, have had some sort of mountaintop experience. Moments when it seems like anything is possible, where we are inspired or exhilarated, where we sense God's presence, or we see the beauty in life in a whole new way. But maybe you're saying to yourself, well, I've had some nice moments in my life, but nothing that compares to this scene with Jesus. Nothing that I would consider a transfiguration experience. But I'd like to suggest that we have. We have experienced God in God's awesome glory. We too have encountered the presence of God, not on a Palestinian mountain, but in worship. Each week we gather together. We gather together to hear God's voice, to focus on the nature of grace as we experience it in the cross, to meet each other in prayer and song, and leave renewed for lives of meaning and purpose. Now, we all have our various motivations for coming to worship. Maybe it's obligation or routine. Maybe it's for the great music or for a brief escape from the hectic pace of our lives. But worship can be so much more. Worship can be a transfiguration moment for each and every one of us every week. That retreat for us to a mountaintop experience where we are surrounded by a glow of hope and possibility in our God. Because the retreat to worship and the time to listen to the word, to be immersed in the cross and be gathered in prayer is what leads inevitably to a return to the everyday world of human need. Worship is a retreat, in other words. But it is not a retreat from the world, but a retreat in order to come back to the world in love, mercy, and grace. After all, the whole point of the mountaintop experience is that we can't stay. Much as we may be like Peter, who wanted to stay, eventually we must all come down the mountain back to the reality of the world. That is what happened for the fans at that rugby stadium in South Africa. That is what happened to Jesus and his disciples, and that's what we find today. When we leave our moments of retreat in renewal, what we find is the world with its needs, its disappointments, and its struggles. Now, had we read just a little bit further in our gospel story today, we would have heard that as Jesus and the disciples came down from the mountain, they were met by this huge crowd of people. And the first one to reach them was a man who was begging, pleading for Jesus to heal his son who is possessed by a demon. And there were others who sought him out. Jesus was met with all sorts of people living in hopelessness, doubt, and despair. But rather than say, forget this and turn around and go back up the mountain, Jesus uses that experience on the mountain as a way of becoming refreshed to return to the needs of the world, maybe even with a renewed sense of compassion and love for the people he ministered to. More than this, the strength Jesus and his disciples received from the transfiguration would be put to the test as they journeyed to Jerusalem, where the events that eventually led to the cross began to unfold. It would be nice if all of life could be mountaintop experiences. But people don't live on the tops of mountains. People live in the valleys. Now, from time to time, we need to come back to the mountain. We need to pray, to worship, to refocus our lives, and hopefully that is something that worship does for you. But then our calling to follow Christ is not a calling that removes us from the realities of the world. Rather, with Christ, we can embrace and enjoy the glowing moments on the mountain, but then return to the daily work of peacemaking, compassionate service, and loving the world in the valleys. Whatever the new insights or new inspiration, the hope and the courage that we draw from such mountaintop experiences, it is invaluable for us as we journey back down the mountain. Amazingly, when we learn to follow Jesus like this, we discover that glory is not just to be found on the mountains. The valleys, as deep as they may be, also glow with the presence and possibility of God's glorious kingdom. Thanks be to God. Amen.